I hope we can now move on to rate impacts. This is a question that comes up over and over and over again, and we didn't give it as much attention maybe as we should have in either of the NSPMs, because we make this key point that benefit cost analyses should be done separately from rate impact analyses. They're answering two different questions, and I'm going to take a minute with this slide to explain that. For the benefit cost analysis, you're looking at the purpose is to see, which resources should a utility invest in to make sure that they're getting net benefits. That's the whole issue, is net benefits. The rate impact analysis is looking, well, what happens to rates? So it's different. The question that are answered in the benefit cost analysis, it's like, what are the future costs and benefits of DERs that we can evaluate? What's going to happen if we invest this dollar here? For the rate impact analysis, the question that's answered is, well, will rates go up? Will rates go down, and by how much? It's a different question. And this is key. This final row here is, so for benefit cost analysis, you look at cumulative cost in present value dollars, cumulative benefits, net benefits, all familiar terms, right? Benefit cost ratios, you can use those to make decisions. For the rate impact analysis, you present the information a little differently. To understand rate impacts, you want to look at, well, what's the cent per kilowatt hour? What's the percent increase in rates? So that you can have a real information that provides you with context to make a decision. Bill impacts, the same thing. What's the dollar per month? What's the percent increase or decrease in bills? And key to this is participation rates, which I'll talk more about as well. That's an important part because equity is really relevant here when you talk about rate impacts. Now, we mentioned earlier that the rate impact measure test is not particularly helpful. The reason is it combines the two analyses into one. It takes the rate impacts and the lost revenues and increased revenues and combines it into one. And as a result, it's really hard to answer either question. It might tell you that rates will go up or down, but it doesn't tell you by how much. And it doesn't tell you about future costs and benefits because it mixes in all these other, basically rate impacts are driven by historical sunk costs and the need to recover them. So we discourage the use of the RIM test just because it makes it very difficult to actually answer the key questions you want to have answered. Next slide. This is kind of key to help you understand the differences. So when you do a benefit cost analysis, okay, as we said many, many times, you got to include the utility system impacts because that tells you about, average bills and revenue requirements and all the rest. Whether you include host customer, societal impacts, depends upon, your policy goals. Things like lost revenues or increased revenues, which you might get through electrification and EVs, you don't include those because they don't really affect future costs and benefits. Net metering, there's builder credits that come out of net metering. Those don't belong in a benefit cost analysis. However, in the rate impact analysis, absolutely, utility system impacts, that's the big driver of rates. Host customer impacts and societal don't affect rates. They don't affect them. So you don't leave them in. Lost revenues, increased revenues, and net metering bill credits, all of them will affect rates. And so those need to be factored in. And so you can see right here why the two are very different, depending upon what you include. And you could see from the slide above as to why it's important to keep them separate. Next slide. You went a little too fast there, and I'll be brief on the previous slide. So we talk about three components. It's not just rates. It's rates, that affects all customers. It's bills, and it's participation. And all three are necessary to understand the whole effect. So next slide, I'll talk more about each of those in just a minute. So these are hypothetical examples, but here's a case where you've got whatever it is, 6 DERs, and you present their rate impacts. And it's important to look at long-term averages because the whole benefit cost analysis is a long-term thing. And in this case, you can see that for some DERs, rates will go up. That's usually driven by the fact that there are lost revenues. There are also downward pressure on rates based upon avoided costs, but mostly it's the lost revenues that create the upward pressure. And, for some DERs like demand response and storage, it might be very small. And then for electrification and EVs, since it increases sales, increases revenues, you can get reduced rates. And it helps to understand all of that. And look at them all independently and give it some thought, and then look at all the ERs combined and see what the total is. More on that in a minute. Next slide. So for participants, for bill impacts, it's a very similar exercise, but here it's a key difference between who participates and who doesn't. If you participate, that's shown in the green lines, you see your bills going down, no matter what DER you participate in. That the whole point is to reduce your bills. If you don't participate, you're just going to see the rate effects. And so the rate effects in some cases will be up. It will make your bills go up, and in some cases they can go down. So this is an important way to distinguish, the nuances between who participates, who benefits, and who doesn't. And then the key thing on the next slide is participation rates. And here along the y-axis, we have the percent of customers who have adopted a DER. And we have on the x-axis 15 years worth of data, because it's helpful to look at a long term. We include both historical and future. And the reason for that is, if you installed a DER, energy efficiency, 4 years ago, and you reduce your bill by 6%, but your rates go up by 1%, that 6% saving still continues as long as those energy efficiency resources are in place. So it's the long-term implication that matters. And you can see that, the penetration might vary quite a bit by DER, and there's a long story behind each one of these, which I can go into offline, but right now we don't have the time. But the key point is, looking at this data is really helpful to see the difference between participants, non-participants, and how rates and bills affect everyone. I have 3 more slides. Sorry to be so quick, but these are kind of key. These kind of bring this all together. And what we said in the manual is you have to look at both. If you want to consider rate impacts, you have to look at both the BCA and rate impact analyses. And the question that always comes up is, well, how do you do that? What does that mean? And this is what it means. It means what we have here is an example of the bottom line results from the benefit cost analysis and the rate impact analysis. And here this is an illustrative example, energy efficiency, the whole portfolio. And I put in some numbers here just to give you some context. The numbers will be different in every state. They could be better, it could be worse, but this is just to give you some context. But this is a kind of a set of results I've seen many times. It's fairly common. And the trick here is sometimes you've got to make trade-offs. There's no way around it. Unfortunately, that's just what this is about. This is where the art comes in. For example, in this case, you've got significant net benefits from your energy efficiency portfolio. Benefit cost ratio of 2.1. That's pretty strong. Looks good so far. But then you've got these rate impacts. And the long-term rate impacts on average are about 1.3%. And that makes some people give some pause. Like, I'm not sure I want that. On the other hand, because it's energy efficiency, you can reach a lot of customers. So you might have many customers participating, and those who participate see lower bills. You might even want to break out low income, because that's an important customer sector. And these numbers here, 68% and 56%, might seem kind of high, but actually I've seen them a lot higher. Because with energy efficiency, all you need is a bunch of light bulbs, and you participate, and you can offset your bill impacts. So they can actually get higher than this, but I put them here again as an illustration. And then finally, in your state, you might have additional considerations just to help this out. And if kind of continuing a theme we had from before, if your state is putting a priority on meeting greenhouse gas targets, you could put that information in here too. And it just helps fill it in the whole picture. And so in this case, you can get to 28% of your targets through energy efficiency. That seems like a pretty good upside. So you've got, the upsides are your reduced costs, your benefit cost ratio is really strong. You've got greenhouse gas benefits, but the downside is rate impacts. You make the call. And I think, different parties will make different calls. Eventually it goes to the commission and they make the final call. So just as one other example, there are many, but demand response, it's just a little different. The dynamics of the resource are different. In this case, you might see smaller net benefits just because of the nature of this. It's not quite as easy to implement, especially for some customers. So they're not as big, maybe not quite as cost effective. In the case of demand response, you could see rates go down because you're avoiding a lot of costs by clipping those peak demands, but you're not reducing sales or not by much. And so your rates go down. You might have fewer customers participate because it's demand response. It's a bit harder. Low-income customers might not, have the wherewithal or even the interest. And for demand response, you might not have a big impact on greenhouse gases because that's just the nature of it. So here, there's no trade-offs because everything looks positive, but it's not as strong. Some of the dimensions aren't as strong as others. So then this last slide is, okay, what if you put everything together? And in my view, this just makes the most sense because this is really what's going to affect customers, is how they affect rates and costs once they're all put into the system. And here, again, these are illustrative. You will have different results in your states. You might have very large net benefits. You add up all of those from efficiency, demand response, and DG, they can get pretty big. You might have an average benefit cost ratio of something like 1.6, or at least a positive, one above one. You might find that together, when you add the rate increases with the rate decreases, it's a fairly modest rate increase. You might even have it so it's a negative rate impact. Again, this is one example. And then participants always see better bills. Here you're going to see higher participation rates because you've got more types of DERs. So that's another dimension to consider. And here, when you put all your DERs together, wow, you can get 86% of your greenhouse gas goals, whatever it is, over your 25 years or so. And so this is just another way to make that kind of tough call and to consider benefit cost analyses and rate impact analyses together to figure out what's really going to make the most sense in your jurisdiction.
Okay, excellent, Tim. Thank you for that whirlwind presentation and great explanations, very clear. We are 5 minutes before or 6 minutes before we're supposed to adjourn. We do want to invite any questions on this last piece, understanding some people might be wrapping up their day or need to move on. So I did see one question from Chris. You just asked Chris to clarify whether participation means sign up for the program or actually implement a measure. These were illustrative examples. I tend to think of as participation as the latter, but I'll defer to Tim on his interpretation.
Yeah, it's a good question to clarify. So in the NSPM, we use the term host customers. A host customer is someone who implements a DER on their residence or their building. And so if it's, let's just say, rooftop solar, you might not participate in any program, but you've got it, you're a host customer, or even storage. So what we mean by participation is, I mean, the number of customers who have adopted the DER, because that's helps indicate, how extensive your policies are, the policies that you're evaluating with your BCAs.
So, Tim, this probably isn't going to be a surprise to you, but when thinking about demand response, as an example, you see utilities report on participation as meaning signups, which in some people's opinion may accomplish a certain amount of goal, but then that DR program never gets called. And so in thinking about the cost benefit analysis, how do you sort of manage that trade-off of a bunch of people signing up, which do result in some benefits, but then not having the program ever be called means you're not maximizing the benefits. So how do you sort of manage those differences in identifying the benefits?
Yeah, good question. We talk about that in the NSPM, but the bottom line is if you really want to capture an actual benefit that occurs. And so in the case of demand response, if customers aren't called, there may not be a benefit, and therefore you may not include it. It's a bit of a nuance. If even having them on call allows you to avoid a particular peak or a particular investment, maybe there's a benefit there. So it may not be as simple an answer as a yes or a no, but I think in general, it's probably mostly a no.
I think that's an example of the factors that affect impacts and different use cases. Ownership and control of a DR is another one. And the assumptions that need to be made and how much control does the utility have over the resource versus the customer. And is that going to affect what percentage of benefits you might assume will materialize? And I think the DR example is similar. Other questions? Let's just see here before. Okay. Any other questions? These are just some comments going back and forth. Goodbye, Joe. He had to leave. We covered a lot of ground today. I really appreciate all the chat and the feedback. And we do have one more poll I'd love to issue before everybody adjourns. You learned, we took a deep dive on a few topics today, but I think going forward, we've been in some discussion with NRRI and the RTI platform, training platform, regulatory training initiative that's been launched about bringing some training on the topic of BCA and some of what you learned today more comprehensively. And we're still in the process of talking to NRI about this and also developing that curriculum. So please provide feedback here on other topics you think would be helpful for you or for your colleagues, your fellow colleagues, to learn about the BCA and what information the NSPM has to offer, and even beyond. We are looking next year to work in coordination, we hope with continued coordination with DOE and other key partners to develop further materials that can help jurisdictions apply the NSPM and make information more readily available, things like methods, tools, and techniques for estimating different impacts and the like. And developing case studies is another area we are actively working to scope for developing next year. Okay, so this is helpful to get this feedback. Thank you. That's all we have on our end. I'll turn it back over to Carrie and Danielle.
Thank you so much, Julie and Tim.